Hello Superset Maniacs and welcome back to my channel. Chris Bumstead just finished second place at his Pro Open debut behind a Mr. Olympia first call-out athlete Martin Fitzwater. According to many fans and experts, it was quite a close or even a controversial second, since the main reason he lost seems to be that he doesn't yet have the mass and fullness of a seasoned Open competitor. I thought a great matchup for C-Bum would be someone from the 90s when bodybuilders looked more similar to what Chris brought to the stage in Prague. Less full but dry and detailed. And what better representative of these qualities than Dorian Yates with his 1993 Mr. Olympia physique. This physique of Dorian is considered the one that started the mass monster era, and even though at the time it was something unseen for someone to have that amount of mass with that level of conditioning, it would look too flat in comparison to what bodybuilders became in the following decades like Ronnie Coleman, Jay Cutler, and even today's bodybuilders, who are much fuller and rounder than the athletes from the 90s. So Dorian Yates 1993 Mr. Olympia vs Chris Bumstead 2024 Prague Pro. Unfortunately, pictures of great quality from decent angles for 1993 Dorian are a rarity, so I'm gonna mostly rely on this footage which does 1993 Dorian justice, despite the low quality. Front double biceps. They look quite similar when it comes to the frame, both with wide structures and longer limbs, but Chris has smaller hips and a tighter waist. They also have very similar biceps development, being probably one of their weakest departments. When it comes to the legs, C-Bum has the better sweeps, but Dorian's quad separation might be second to none. Also, Dorian has very powerful calves and also forearms over Chris. Both have great lats, which create nice silhouettes for both of them. However, Chris Bumstead's tinier waist and vacuum pose make a big difference compared to Dorian's semi-relaxed midsection. Now, Dorian still looks fuller overall, but because of the overall flow and look, I would give this first pose to Chris Bumstead. Front lat spread is next, the pose you probably clicked on this video for in the first place. Now first, the lower body. We already established what's up from the front. C-Bum would have the advantage of having the better quad sweeps, which gives him a superior X-frame if you're looking at this aspect, but Dorian's X-frame is given by his calves, reminiscent of the golden era. When it comes to the upper body, let's take a look at some clearer pictures because we need a better view. Let's also make C-Bum's picture black and white for consistency. Now, we all know the Dorian Yates story in the front lat spread pose. He's considered untouchable and for good reason. It's mostly because of how big his lats look from the front. Nobody had such lats ever. Dorian also has a certain elegance when hitting this pose that, even though sometimes you have more muscular bodybuilders like Ronnie Coleman or Big Ramy pushing him hard, he still comes out on top overall. Chris Bumstead is the closest that comes to Dorian's aura in this pose. He has a similar wide structure and similar great lat development. Moreover, Chris's midsection is tighter and his quad sweeps are superior, which give him a superior X-frame effect. However, we can clearly notice that Dorian is still more massive, rounder through the arms and shoulders, and arguably has a fuller chest too. At least this is how it looks here. Also, Dorian's lats remain much more dominant, and his razor-sharp quads and huge calves tie everything together, still making Dorian undeniable in this pose. Now, a fully developed open bodybuilding Chris Bumstead might be a different story, but as they look here, I would give the shadow the edge, so the score becomes 1-1. The side chest pose is next, and this is one of Dorian's weaker poses, and on the other hand, it's one of Chris's strongest ones. Dorian Yates didn't have great pecs, that's why I was surprised in the previous pose, but here we can see that his chest was a weaker point for him in terms of size and fullness, and also his execution choice is not the best one. Dorian also never had great shoulders despite being very detailed and defined. The shadow also didn't excel when it comes to the side leg not having great outer quads, and also the 90s execution of the side poses didn't focus on the hanging hamstring as today. On all these aspects I mentioned about Dorian not being quite very strong, Chris Bumstead actually excels in contrast. C-Bum has a nice big striated chest, fuller shoulders and a superior side leg. From the side, Dorian doesn't showcase the thickness we saw from the front, exposing C-Bum as still a classic competitor. So overall, this is a pretty clear win for Chris Bumstead. Rear double biceps is next, and on paper, Chris Bumstead should not have any chance against Dorian Yates in this pose. Dorian had arguably the best back of all time, at least in terms of separation and hardness, while for C-Bum, his back was almost always one of his weaker departments. However, by looking at this footage, you might think otherwise. Besides Dorian's low quality footage, there's also the different ways they're hitting the pose. Even though Dorian had one of the best back double biceps ever, he never spread his lats enough in my opinion, the way Chris is doing it here. And we know he's got all the lats in the world. So let's take a look at some better quality pictures so we can see exactly why Dorian Yates is actually winning this pose. Even though his picture is still not quite high def, we can see that Dorian's back is crisper, much more separated, with bigger traps and a better lower back. Also downstairs, Dorian's hamstrings are underrated, and his calves are simply the best ever for any Mr. Olympia winner at least. So Dorian wins the back double and makes the score 2-2. If you're enjoying my content, consider subscribing. A big portion of you, around 73%, are not subscribed, and it would mean a lot to me to reach that 30k subs milestone by the end of this year. I appreciate it, guys. Next pose is the rear lat spread, and this one is easier to judge as when Dorian opens up his wings, it's game over. For C-Bum, this pose isn't a mandatory in classic, and we rarely see him hitting it, but I gotta say that I'm impressed with his look. He definitely has all the potential in the world when it comes to the back lat spread because of his wide frame and great lat development, but he's going up against the best back of all time here, and in the lat spread you can really see why Dorian is the best. His lats are second to none, he's hard, he's detailed and separated, his lower body flows perfectly with his upper body, and C-Bum has no chance in this pose against all that. The score becomes 3-2 for Dorian Yates. Next up is the side triceps, and yes, Chris beat Dorian in the side chest pose, but the side triceps is a whole other story with Dorian Yates. He's often considered to have the best side triceps of all time, and on the other hand, I believe that this was Chris Bumstead's weakest pose at the Prague Pro. Granted, this too isn't a mandatory pose in classic, and also Chris has the tools to hit a great side triceps, but I really didn't like the presentation of this pose. He squeezed down, looked uncomfortable, and then immediately went into the front triceps execution, which might look good for a routine, but it's a no-no during the compulsories. Dorian's look speaks for itself. This pose goes to him easily, making the score 4-2. Abs and thighs is next, and Dorian is quite underrated when it comes to this pose in my opinion. First, his legs are strong with separation second to none and probably the best teardrops of all time. He only lacked quad sweeps, but at least with this execution he poses around that weakness very well. And we can't overlook the calves when they're that strong. Moreover, Dorian had quite good abs development. His abs were defined, his obliques were too, and due to his huge lats, he had a very impressive taper as well. Chris Bumstead looks good, but his abs were never defined enough and his stance always made him look a bit narrow in my opinion. But C-Bum also has a vacuum execution under his sleeve, and this becomes an argument. By today's judging criteria, it is acceptable to hit only the vacuum in the abs and thighs, and the judges are basically looking for who looks better in this pose. So I have this clearer picture to analyze. If we're strictly asking who looks more beautiful in this pose, I believe C-Bum is the safe answer. But personally, I would never choose a vacuum over defined abs. I also believe that Dorian's superior mass through the lats and his great lower body makes him deserve to win this pose overall for what it should mean in bodybuilding. If it was a beauty contest, C-Bum is the safe answer, but in bodybuilding I would go with Dorian based on these shots. Last pose is the most muscular, a pose that wasn't a mandatory during Dorian's reign, and it also isn't a mandatory in classic physique. In the hands clasped variation, Dorian is crisper, grainier, but his shoulders and chest are flatter in comparison to C-Bum. But the big difference is in the crab variation, where Chris's muscle separation through the chest and arms overshadows Dorian's package. Let's be honest, Dorian was fortunate this pose wasn't a mandatory during his reign, because this arguably would have been his weakest one in my opinion. Chris Bumstead wins this last pose. So in conclusion, the final score is 5-3 for Dorian Yates. Maybe a tight score for some, but if we think about it, C-Bum still looks too small, even against a guy from the beginning of the 90s. And even though that guy is Dorian Yates, Dorian was still too depleted for today's men's open bodybuilding. So yes, Chris Bumstead looked great in Prague, but he still looked more or less classic physique. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section about this comparison. Make sure to leave a like for the algorithm and also subscribe to help me reach 30k subscribers by the end of the year. Catch you in the next one.